PodCAP is brought to you by Smogon.com. With the usage stats for February now posted, now is the perfect time to get into your favorite metagame. Whether that's OU, UU, RU, NU, or PU, you can find usage stats and more at Smogon.com. And the Create a Pokemon Discord server. Did you know that when your concept wins the concept poll, you're allowed to use the @here command, but only in the Create a Pokemon Discord server. Join today! Hello everyone, welcome back for another exciting episode of PodCAP. I'm your host Voltage, and today I'm by myself, which is fine. But I figured that now that CAP27 is underway, we could get a look at some of the recently finished stages of CAP27. Currently it is March 22nd, which means we have decided on a concept, but I figured it would be important to look back on some of the concepts that were submitted, as well as the slate for CAP27, since there were a number of fantastic concepts that were submitted. Now, of course, I am a little biased with the concepts that were submitted, but I figured we'd look at the slate and we'd talk about some of the interesting ideas that were presented, starting with the top 6 that were presented. And we'll start with Quanyales. How do you even say that name? I don't even know. So we'll start with that and their concept Tempo. Basically a Pokemon that explores the concept of turn efficiency or tempo in battles, where basically their justification was making a massive impact on your opponent in the least amount of turns, whether that's, being able to damage an opponent when they enter with entry hazards, recovering, and maybe switching out all in the same turn. Something along those lines, or maybe debuffing an opponent, or setting up some sort of field mechanic. And they were sort of asking, under the target category, what are some of these characteristics, abilities, and moves that are really efficient or inefficient, and how can we make moves more or less efficient over the course of the battle, with a specific focus as well on RNG and how that might come into play as well. Personally, I think that this concept is pretty neat. I'm going to say that a lot, by the way, just because tempo is something that is really, really important when you're battling, especially if you're trying to set up your win condition properly. My one hang-up on this concept right out of the gate was the idea that CAP26 Equilibra kind of did this in a way, or at least explored it, because Equilibra focused a lot on Doom Desire. And with Doom Desire, you're doing damage 2 to 3 turns later, excuse me. So in theory, you could, put that landmine down, for example, and then Libra could effectively rapid spin, it could toxic before the nerf, it could do a lot of different things in order to really sway momentum back to your side of the battlefield. So I was interested in this idea, but there were some bits of it that I was a little, felt that we had already sort of covered with previous projects. So I did obviously vote for all the ones in the first round of voting in the polls and whatnot, but over time they got shortened down. The next concept was Lids, the good old switcheroo, and that is a Pokemon that takes advantage of item swapping moves such as switcheroo or trick, with an archetype concept, swapping items between Pokemon. So one of the inspirations behind this that Lid actually said as well, that I will find in the concept submission thread, which I'm going to cut this part out maybe, who knows, probably not. Yeah, their post is basically saying that there are currently a lot of Choice Scarf or Switcheroon or Trick users like Latios, Gengar, and Rotom Wash in previous OUs, but now in this metagame we're seeing a lot more interesting trickers, whether that's like Flame Orb Obstagoon, or Trick Ring Target Rotom Wash, or as Lid also mentioned, like Trick Sticky Barb Clefable. So there's a lot of different opportunities for these strange uses of Trick, or removing your item rather and throwing it onto someone else, which could be really, really interesting. I personally really like this one a lot just because it seemed like a very fun concept in the grand scheme of things with respect to, how does that sway the momentum of a battle? It's almost kind of like tempo in a way, but a little bit more focused on what can you do to actively hamper your opponent in terms of their positioning in the field as well. Because one of those big ones, for example, is being able to trick maybe a Choice Scarf onto a Corviknight from a Rotom, for example, or doing tricking, Obstagoons, again, Flame Orb onto something that definitely doesn't want that. It's an interesting concept, and I think it would be very, very cool if this one were resubmitted for a future topic as well. I think one thing also that really leans into this concept as well is that there are currently a number of choice users in CAP metas right now, but there's not a ton that really would be like good necessarily for outright tricking. So I think it would be interesting further along to explore that a little bit more, and if there's any like defensive or offensive capabilities in general. Moving right along, we're moving to Sun Miser's concept, Contrast is Key. And we'll also have one other similar one moving forward, but we'll start with Sun Miser since it's more general. The Contrast is Key archetype, where a Pokemon that can perform two contrastingly different roles, but not at the same time, where this sort of fits into archetype actualization. What it comes down to with Sun Miser's submission, which I think is really fascinating, is that, Contrast is Key allows for such a variety of Pokemon, what I mean by that is that you can just do so much with it, and it's really interesting. And especially not at the same time, I think, is what makes it so fun. Just because you're constantly thinking, okay, based on their team buildup, what are they going to present? Is this Pokemon going to be more offensive as a result? More defensive as a result? One of those ones that Sun Miser actually referenced in their explanation was Leviathan, one CAP number 20. And that one had the boosting through with both physical and special boosting. So it could be one or the other, but not necessarily both at the same time. And I think that's really interesting, but it can be done very differently with this concept. Specifically where you have, like, as Sun Miser put it, an offensive powerhouse or a decent mixed tank. So, it's a interesting concept, and I actually really like the idea, especially when you consider the limitations of how do we make sure that this does not just become some busted mon that it's like, oh my god, I have no idea what it's going to be. And, you could do that through choice or 4 move slot syndrome. I do think actually one of the best examples of this is Gen 7 Landorus Therian, just because, not necessarily adhering to the 2, but a variety of different concepts. Just because you could have Scarf, you could have Tank, you could have Flynium Z, you could even have like some Lure special attacking one, which is utter garbage, don't use it, some Life Orb set. So there's a lot of possibility there, and I would highly recommend that in the future, this one maybe get resubmitted as well, just because, like, damn, it is fun. And following up on that actually is the other similar role-changing concept, which is QZLs, excuse me, that's how you pronounce it apparently, of role switching it up. And that's very similar, but it's more of an actualization where the Pokemon fulfills two or more different roles, but it switches during the battle as opposed to before the battle, which I think, again, I really like the idea. I think this is my second choice if the winning one didn't actually get it. And, the canonical examples of these really are like Calm Mind, Clefable, and Oras, or Rotom Heat with the heavy-duty boots. Rotom Heat in particular just being able to Nasty Plot and Volt Switch, Overheat, and usually like Thunder Wave or Wisp or something, where usually Rotom Heat has like really good defensive typing and works really well as a pivot, but as soon as some of its resists are weakened, you can just go to town on the opponent.
Hello, Mr. Spider. You are climbing on my window.
So there's a lot of things that this concept does really well that I really like. Especially QZL does a lot of references to some of the other Pokemon that I know very well can be very good, like NU Comfy from Sun and Moon. That mon is really good acting as sort of like an early game just sort of tank, or sort of not necessarily a tank, but can sort of absorb some hits and put some pressure on, but then immediately start to CM and then use Triage, Draining Kiss, or Giga Drain to really win games as a win condition. Essentially, what this concept kind of boils down to is figuring out what is the cause usually for things causing roles to effectively switch during a fight, but then also how is it basically, does a Pokemon become sort of one roll into almost a win condition? That's not to say, too, that this concept necessarily needs to be something turning into a win condition, but that's kind of, if I were to do this, that would be sort of my natural progression on where this one would go. Just because all of the examples QZL has listed are effectively, breakers into win conditions, or pivots into win conditions, or, setup mons like Body Press Como, for example, setting up rocks, and then once all the fairy types and, like Dragapult are gone, it just sets up Iron Defense and Body Presses to a win. Side note, that mon is phenomenal. Please use it all the time. I love that thing. Anyway, so that's QZLs, and then there's Snake Rattlers, actually, which is a one-hit wonder. And that concept is, you see it and you think, okay, Dracovish, because it's basically a Pokemon that has one really, really good move that it can consistently use, and then it gets maybe some weaker coverage, but nothing that's going to make it outright broken. And so when I saw that, I thought, okay, this mon is definitely like, Dracovish, Dracozolt, Arctovish, Arctozolt with Vicious Red and Bulk Beat. But if you think about it, Snake actually listed a couple others that I really like thinking about, especially with going back to Sun and Moon OU, Tapu Koko's Thunderbolt being boosted by Electric Terrain and Stab just being so good. It really just sort of comes down to being a very consistent, threatening move that your opponent has to play around. And the thing is then, too, Koko doesn't really have any other moves in its move pool that's going to be outright threatening. Sure, it gets like Hidden Power Ice in Sun and Moon, or U-Turn, or Brave Bird, but none of these really lean into Koko's role in the metagame necessarily, being either a pivot or like Magnet Koko, or something along those lines. So I think it's really interesting of a concept, because this gen really got some cool new ways to explore that. Obviously, I'm not advocating for another Vicious Rend or Boltbeak user, because, no thank you. But I do think it's really interesting to watch that. Other examples, Snake included, are again like Tornadus Therian's Hurricane, AV Magirna's Fleur Cannon, both in Gen 7. Basically, these are just really powerful moves on a Pokemon that then also have, some weaker coverage as well, but that primarily are going to be attacking using that single move. And that sort of idea has really leaned into the last concept on the slate, but I'll get back to that in just a moment. And I think it's also very important with this concept, this one-hit wonder concept, that the question asked, like, how offensive does it need to be in order to really be a successful move user? Because, this move idea leans into an offensive Pokemon, because, you have Obstagoon's Facade, or Araquanid's Liquidation. Something along those lines is obviously very present, but, you don't really see a ton of outright defensive Pokemon having a single, BAM! Powerful move, So we would be very interested to see how this goes forward. And then the last concept, which is actually my concept, so I held off on explaining this one until the end just because I know this one very well, and I don't want to put any more bias on this concept that it already has, but it's offensive team support, the concept formerly known as Trickster Cleric. So basically, a little bit of backstory for this concept, which I was thinking about, is that I was walking back from class listening to Critical Role, and I was thinking about, since CAP, the submissions were opening up later that day, I was like, we don't really have a Trickster Cleric Pokemon. And when I say Trickster Cleric, I'm not referring to the idea of a cleric using like aromatherapy or heal bell to heal its partners. Rather, I'm thinking more of, the character Jester in the game, who is often using attacks to support their allies, but also can use, like, healing hands, for example, to heal at 4th level or whatever. I haven't played a cleric in Dungeons & Dragons. I only play fighters and rogues. But in any case, it's one of those cases where CAP really hasn't explored the idea much either, with the only true support mon that CAP has made is Fidget. And that was explicitly like a Trick Room, Tailwind, like, you know, extender thing, and that was explored all the way back in Diamond and Pearl. So when I was thinking about this, I was thinking, wow, we really haven't explored a concept like this since Gen 4. So it would be cool to maybe go back and see if we could roll with a more offensively based support Pokemon. Now, obviously, there's more I could go into with this, but again, I don't want to influence any discussions going on right now because Trickster Cleric, offensive team support, the concept formerly known as Trickster Cleric, did end up winning. It was my plan to interview the winner of the concept submission stage, but here I am. Suck it. But in any case, one of the questions that I think is really important about offensive team support, the concept formerly known as Trickster Cleric, is that we need to figure out what does the word support mean. Is it a healing Pokemon? Is it setting up entry hazards? Is it absorbing status? Is it like healing their Pokemon in general? Or is it like setting up conditions for the Pokemon to win? Honestly, when I was setting up this concept, I was really thinking like of an offensive Pokemon that can use offense to generate opportunities for healing later. The big one, actually, one of my favorite Pokemon to use in Sword and Shield OU, actually pre-home, was Sylveon, where it gets Wish and Protect and Mystical Fire. I know I've mentioned Sylveon in my concept, but people were sort of thinking Hyper Voice. Actually, I was thinking about Mystical Fire being able to lower the special attack of Pokemon out on the field so that Sylveon can like then effectively Wish and bring in one of its partners that might not be able to take, for example, Clefable's Moonblast as well if it were at even versus Clefable being at like -2 special attack, for example. So that was kind of the idea I was thinking there. Or another idea would be if, like, for example, Grimmsnarl with Screens and Spirit Break, but then if it also had gotten some form of like healing. Obviously, the concept stage now is underway, and I will post more about it myself as it comes along, but that was kind of the initial thought process with that. Obviously, now things have evolved, and maybe that's not going to be the path we go down further down the line, but I think it's really cool. And I'm really excited that my concept got chosen. This is a small personal tangent here. This is my first ever submission for CAP with anything, regardless of like move pool, ability slate, what have you. So I'm really excited that my concept got chosen, and I'm really thankful for everyone who voted for this. But I'm also really glad that we had such a strong slate this submission, just because there was a very long period between Equilibra and our new CAP. So I just want to say to those listening, please resubmit concepts for the next one too, because I literally workshopped this one in my brain for a while. Or I wouldn't say I workshopped it, but I was very nervous about this one, and I wanted to make sure that it was the best it could be, and especially against all of the really good submissions this round. I was legitimately like, I was going to be happy with anything that got picked. So I'm really honored that you guys chose to pick mine, and I'm very excited to see what we can do with this further down the line. There were some other concepts too that I really liked that didn't make the slate that I think would be also really good to submit as well further along. And one of those actually is Snores. Now, Snore has been submitting this one for a while, but I think it's really worth like maybe looking into further down the line. I think it would be a bit of a it would not it's a coat of many colors, or a Pokemon that takes advantage of multiple resist berries. I know that we had a Flash Cap, Chewworm, excuse me, that sort of took advantage of different like berry consumptions as well. But I think it's really interesting, this coat of many colors concept, especially with the sort of bias in attacking types this gen. Is like, for example, with the dominance of ghost types, really being there. I think it'd be really cool. And Snore sort of comments about this with community incentivizing certain moves and how we could maybe use that prediction or that like incentivization against players, whether it's like Pajantum's Spirit Shackle or Equilibra's Doom Desire. You know, what matters with this concept, I think, would be just making sure that stats are correctly done. Because, again, as Snore mentions, this concept is made or broken by its stats, just because you are basically basing a concept around its held item. So you're going to have to give a Pokemon a typing, perhaps, that may not be as useful as some other targets. For example, like, Pure Fairy is a really good typing. Steel Flying is a really good typing. But a typing like, for example, Poison Electric maybe isn't as good of a typing. Or, like, Fire Rock, for example. So the idea of Resist Berries being able to reduce damage is something that's really interesting. The one thing I think also that really holds this idea back, especially this gen, is the removal of Natural Gift that allows a Pokemon to attack based on the berry it holds. I think this concept would have been way better for Sun and Moon, just because Natural Gift is still a move. But I think it still would be really interesting to explore further down the line. So that's kind of my thought on that. Let's see. Let me find the other one since I'm scrolling through. I also really like Wonder Warrior, even only if it's like just something that I've really wanted to see for a long time. The concept basically is a Pokemon that can utilize undervalued field effects to their fullest potential, while also using being successful in other field effects. So, like, not necessarily even just weather and terrain or Trick Room, but also like Gravity, Wonder Room, Magic Room. I've always wanted a weather effect or a field effect that auto Trick Rooms when you come in, and I think it would be super cool to like see how that could impact the metagame. Just because offensive Trick Room is such an interesting and fun concept when done correctly, especially with like Sun and Moon Magearna, or like in this gen like Hatterene, for example. And you could also really then see how that plays to the strengths of its teammates. With, like, for example, Auto Trick Room, or not necessarily Auto Trick Room, but a Pokemon that uses, like, Wonder Room, for example. And I believe that's the one that switches defense and special defense, or vice versa. I think, again, it's very specific, but I think that's what makes it really interesting. And the other thing, too, is you could definitely explore how you can make this different from Fidget, for example. Again, since Fidget likes to set up Trick Room or Tailwind. It's just a matter of seeing what you can do with sort of field effects more than anything. Because again, weather and like kind of terrain are really the only true prominent ones this generation so far. So I really like that concept as well. Let's see. There was also the idea, Burkle, with their obviously cool concepts that they always have one every generation or every cap. This one is future-proof, and this one is interesting to me. I don't necessarily know if I like it or dislike it. I think it would take a lot of setup, but enough stepping around the bush. The idea of future-proof, this Pokemon is not only competitively viable in this generation of Pokemon games, but for many more to come. I think the hardest part about this one is obviously, as listed in Burkle's questions to be asked, like, how well can we predict Game Freak's changes to the world of Pokemon, and how Smogon will respond to them competitively? And I think the biggest kind of example is a certain cap that I don't want to say the name, but definitely got shafted with the introduction of fairy types, introduction of fairy types, to the point where now it's like not usable at all. Or for example, a Pokemon like Crucible and Mega Crucible, how currently Megas are just not in Sword and Shield, so, you know, you can't really use Crucible after, because it got nerfed too, and so we want to make sure that it's usable going forward. So it's one of those questions where how can you even predict what Game Freak is going to do next, especially with like Dynamax and all that garbage. But one of the things that, you look to an example that I've actually mentioned a couple times, but like, Clefable has been consistently good since it got the fairy type in Gen 6. But, there were times before then where Clefable was only so-so, whereas Pokemon like Gengar have been OU every generation aside from Gen 7. Or like when Pokemon that are introduced, like Tyranitar, for example, being the face of Gen 3, and then just like still having a presence in every OU since it was introduced. Or like Ferrothorn, since it was introduced in Gen 5, has just always been good. It's about investigating why these Pokemon have always been good, despite constant evolutions to how the games work, or like the introductions of Megas and Z Crystals and whatnot. Again, personally, I think this one is just hard to do because you have no idea what Game Freak's gonna do. You have no idea. No one saw Dynamax coming from a mile away. I mean, if we look back towards like leaks, for example, people thought that there would be like armored evolutions, and everyone was worried about that. And like, I was heavily involved in exploring the leaks of Gen 8, and no one saw Dynamax coming. But like Dynamax, it just doesn't work in a singles metagame, and given that Cap is primarily a singles meta, we don't have Cap doubles yet. Should look into that at some point, guys. Because Cap is a singles metagame, it's really hard to predict what Game Freak's going to do, and then how that change is going to effectively impact singles. Because, again, I think I won't get into Dynamax too much here, but the reason for Dynamax in Gen 8 being banned in singles is just because it just doesn't effectively work in singles, but it's an amazing concept in doubles. So, and since Game Freak primarily builds their concepts around doubles, we can't know how, one, Game Freak is going to make their new concepts, and then two, how those concepts are going to impact singles as opposed to doubles. So, it's interesting, but you have no way to predict, and I think that's my biggest issue with this, with that one concept, which I would love to see again maybe in the future, but hard to say for now. There was another concept actually that was submitted right before the deadline that I think is also really cool, and that is exponential growth. It's hard to really get a grasp on it since we didn't have a ton of time to think about it, but the idea is using utility of items or moves that relate to increased damage over time or how we use it. So like the item Metronome or Echoed Voice rollout, Speed Boost. Obviously Speed Boost isn't that great, or I don't think it's allowed in Cap, but it's still like an idea of like maybe even a Pokemon that just uses Metronome, the item, not the move, to be successful. And you can look at Kyurem actually in the Sword and Shield OU right now. It's really freaking good with specs, but it's also really good with a Metronome. But I think one of the really cool questions to be answered with this concept is like, how do moves like instant gratification moves like Focus Blast or Stone Edge preferred to like, consistently using like, obviously no one uses this, but like Rock Slide. Why do people not use Rock Slide with a Metronome to get that boost over time or something like that? And how reliant should CAP27 be on items versus its move slots? So I think that's really interesting as well. And it really just sort of builds off the momentum of the moves it's using. Like, again, with Jump Bow and Moonblast and Tornadus Theory and with Hurricane. It's these Pokemon, again, that have this one consistently powerful move. And I feel like Snake's concept, again, sort of gets back to the idea of all of that. So that's kind of, those are some of the biggest concepts that I saw that I really liked in this slate. But there's always going to be really, really good ones as well. Again, just to name a few other general ones, just a framework that I saw that was interesting, like NFE, an unevolved Pokemon that can survive in Cap, for example. I thought that was really interesting. There's the other one that was like Up and Down You Go, the Pokemon that uses raising and lowering its stats of itself and others to be really cool. I thought that one could be cool with a little bit of time. There's also like customizable Core Crusher, or a Pokemon that has necessary tools to be effective at breaking and neutralizing other cores without being able to handle every core at the same time. There was one of those cases where caps in cores and designing a cap around a core maybe isn't the greatest idea, but it's interesting to see a cap that's designed to break a core, like cap that's exclusively built to defeat Corviknight plus Clefable plus Seismitoad. I think that could be really cool. And so, I'd say going forward, it could be really, really cool to see further concepts being made. But again, the current concept that was chosen is mine, so I'm very happy about that. And I am the proud father of CAP27, offensive team support, the concept formerly known as Trickster Cleric. So currently, depending on how quickly I can get this up, the concept assessment is still going on right now. It'll be open for a little while longer, and there are plenty of interesting questions that you can answer and get involved with. So if you are all interested or have ever wanted to maybe get involved in CAP, now is kind of one of those perfect times since we're right at the start of the new project. I'm really excited to see what will be created from my brainchild, and I really look forward to being able to eventually use CAP27. Lord knows that when CAP Team Tournament 6 rolls around, the first team I will be using will use this Pokemon in some way. So that'll be that. The other thing too is that if that someone decides to make a team with this Pokemon as their mascot, please let me know and I'll co-captain. Anyway, but that's all for this this PodCAP. A little shorter, but still just a wonderful time. Anyway, if you enjoyed this episode of podcast, hello? If you enjoyed this episode of PodCAP, please leave a like, subscribe, don't forget to smash that like button, hit that bell, all that garbage like that. And I will be seeing you more for future PodCAPs down the line. Until then, I'm having a little too much fun with this.